Good. Okay. No? Okay. Well, it is on.
Speak into it.
Zip it. Okay. Thank you, Susmit, again for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I know there is an exciting computing session going on, so it means a lot that you're here. This talk is about a new and exciting technology called non-volatile memory. So let me start with a quick introduction and dive in immediately. So traditionally, the storage in our computers is divided into two categories. On the one hand, we have the random access memory, the RAM, which is fast to access to read and write, but it is volatile in a sense that if there's a power failure, if there's a crash, when you restart your machine, the contents of the RAM will be lost. On the other hand, we have the hard disk drive, which is slow to access by comparison, but it is persistent, and it preserves its contents across power failures. Now, non-volatile memory, or NVM for short, is a hybrid of these two worlds, bringing you the best of both. So it is fast to access, but it is also persistent. Now, NVM is becoming so prevalent that Intel, who are traditionally CPU manufacturers, are now looking into developing their own line of NVM technology. In fact, as of last year, mid-2019, they have released their own line of NVM called Optane 3D technology. Now, from our point of view in the verification community, what we are interested in is understanding the behaviors of programs in this new NVM context. For instance, in the traditional volatile setting, I know that if I have a program like this, a memory location X initially holds value 0. I run this program, I assign 1 to X, and afterwards I know that X will hold value 1. And of course, if my program crashes and I restart my machine, there is no recovery, I will lose my work, and X will be 0 again, right? The initial value that it had. By contrast, in the NVM context, if the same thing happens and I restart my machine, so long as there's an appropriate recovery mechanism in place, I can actually recover my work from before the crash and observe that X is 1. Of course, these are intuitive and informal behaviors that we expect, but we are in the business of specifying these guarantees formally and making sure that they hold. In fact, we want to go one step further and show such properties in the concurrent context. What are the possible behaviors of concurrent programs in the NVM context? So to answer this question, we need to understand first how the concurrent models of computation became to be what we know and love today. So let's start with a quick history lesson. John is laughing.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So it all started in the 40s by Alan Turing, the father of computing, who proposed a sequential model of computation. Now, at some point, we realized that if you want to harness the horrible noise of our rapidly evolving technology, we need to look into more sophisticated models of computation, concurrent models of computation, where we have multiple threads working in parallel together in order to achieve a task. And this is where Leslie Lamport, the Turing Award winner, proposed the sequential consistency model to describe the behavior of concurrent programs. And essentially, this model says that if you have a concurrent program, its overall behavior can be described in terms of an interleaving of the instructions in each thread. So essentially, you have this total execution order that prescribes the program behavior. Now, this is a simple and intuitive model, but it's not realistic. In fact, no existing hardware out there provides you with SC guarantees by default, and you have to bend over backwards to convince your hardware to give you these SC guarantees. And this is why researchers such as Peter Sewell, who is standing right in the corner over there, started looking into more realistic models of computation, collectively known as weak memory consistency. And essentially what weak memory consistency says is that forget about this total execution order because it's not realistic. As a result, you should expect weak behaviors or anomalies that are not possible in the SC context. And this could be because either your compiler decides to reorder some instructions, or it's because of the way the writes are propagated across the cache hierarchy. Now, since we no longer have this total execution order, what we typically use to describe the behavior of such programs, we use something called a consistency model. And a consistency model essentially describes the order in which the writes of one thread become visible to all other threads. There are several consistency models out there, both at the hardware level and the language level. For instance, we have the x86 TSO model that I will talk about later. Now, what I want to convince you of in the next couple of minutes is that understanding the behavior of concurrent programs in the context of NVM is one layer of complexity above everything else that we have seen so far. So with weak memory consistency being the state of the art in concurrency semantics, what does it mean now to extend that to the NVM context? To see why my claim holds and why this is much harder in the MVM context, let me start with a simple example. And in fact, for the time being, let's forget about concurrency and just focus on a sequential program in the MVM context and see what the challenges are. Spoiler. So here I have a simple program, two memory locations, x and y. They both initially hold value 0. I run this program, I assign 1 to both x and y, and then my program crashes, I restart my machine, and now I want to know what are the possible behaviors. Now, one possibility is that I get lucky and I recover all my work from before, and x and y are now, both now hold value 1. Great. But it's also possible for me to lose all of my work and see that x and y are both 0. Now, this might come as a surprise because you would think that the whole point of NVM is that you recover your work when you restart the machine. So why is it possible to lose it? And the answer to that is that for performance reason, every time the CPU issues a write, it doesn't necessarily become persistent immediately, but rather it's buffered somewhere, and at some future point it will be propagated to memory asynchronously, at which point it becomes persistent. So if you were unlucky enough that when the crash occurred, neither of these writes had actually propagated to persistent memory, you would see that x and y are both 0. Now, for the same reason, if the crash occurred after the first write to x had persisted, but not before the write to y, then you will see x is 1 and y is 0. But most surprisingly, it's also possible to observe these persists out of order. It's possible for you to see the write to y, the second write, but not the write to x. And this is particularly surprising because even in an architecture like x86, where during normal executions you will never observe this behavior, you will never see the writes out of order, it's still possible to crash, restart the machine, and see these writes out of order for having persisted. So, and this is all in the sequential context, so you can see there are some strange behaviors even when we don't think about consistency. Now think of extending this to the concurrency context and what that would entail. So we talked about consistency models and how they describe the orders in which the writes become visible to other threads. The analog of that is, say, something we call a persistency model, which talks about the order in which the writes persist in memory. And whenever we talk about MVM semantics, we really mean the combination of both the consistency and the persistency. So a consistency model describes the program behavior during normal executions. Your persistency model describes the program behavior after a crash, and together they give you the overall program semantics. And hopefully you will see why this is one layer of complexity above everything else, because not only do you have to worry about the consistency model and all the complexities and weakness associated with that, but you also have to worry about the persistency semantics and the strange behaviors associated with that and how that interacts with your consistency model. So this was just a brief introduction into MVM semantics and what the challenges are, but in this talk, we are, and in our paper, we are interested in understanding the MVM semantics of the Intel-x86 architecture. So, as a warm-up, just again to keep things simple, let's start with the sequential x86 model and see what its persistency behavior is. So to start off, let's just think of conceptually what the hardware would look like in the sequential x86 model with persistency behavior. So here I have my CPU, and I have the memory at the bottom. So the CPU issues writes, which will go to memory eventually, and reads from memory, and so on. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to put a persistence buffer in between. And the reason I do that is because I want to capture this asynchronous behavior of persist and also the out-of-order behavior of persist. In particular, every time the CPU issues a write, it doesn't immediately go to the memory. It will go to this persistent buffer, and it will eventually be unbuffered from the persistent memory, and it will reach the memory. From the persistence buffer, and it will reach the memory. And as a result, because the writes are staying in this buffer for a while, I can model this asynchronous behavior of persist. Similarly, I can use this persistence buffer to model the out-of-order behavior of persist. For instance, if I write to x and write to y, and they will enter the persistence buffer in that order, I can unbuffer them in the reverse order. I can unbuffer y first and then x, and hence capturing this out-of-order persist behavior. Now, every time the thread issues a read, every time a thread issues a read, it will first check the persistence buffer. If there is an entry there, it will fetch the latest value. Otherwise, it will go to memory. And of course, the memory is non-volatile, it's persistent, so if there is a crash, the contents of the memory will be retained. But remember that the persistence buffer includes those writes that are yet to be persisted. So if there is a crash, those haven't persisted yet, and as a result, you will lose the contents of the persistence buffer. So with this being our conceptual hardware model for sequential x86, now let's go back to those challenges that I mentioned and see how we can, if and how we can solve them in x86. So most importantly, there was this out-of-order relaxed behavior of persist that it's strange, and we want to hopefully stop this behavior in certain cases and make sure they don't persist out of order. Existing literature on persistency have multiple solutions to this problem. They're all hypothetical models with hypothetical solutions, but they're worth a mention. One of these solutions is something called a persist barrier. So essentially in this program, I could insert a barrier between these two writes. And what this barrier does is it ensures that everything before the barrier persists before everything after it. So in this program, this barrier will make sure that the write to X persists before the write to Y, hence stopping the strange behavior. Now, this is a hypothetical model, and it has its advocates out there, but unfortunately, x86 does not provide you with such persist barriers. x86 has all these memory barriers, S fences, M fences, but none of them enforce any ordering on persists. So this is not going to work on its own. The solution number 2 advocated in the literature is something called explicit persists. So essentially what an explicit persist does, if I were to insert it between X and Y here, it says, okay, when you hit this persist X, wait and make sure that every pending write on this cache line and the cache line that contains X is persisted to memory before you move on. So in this example, when I reach here, I will wait. X will be persisted, the cache line containing X will be persisted, and as a result, the writes of 1 to X will reach memory. And I can eliminate this behavior, in particular the out of order, because once I resume execution, I only execute Y is 1 after X has already reached memory. Now here, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that Intel does provide you with such instructions. In fact, it gives you 3 such instructions: the cache line write back, the cache line flush optimal, and the cache line flush. But the bad news is that, well, the bad news is twofold. First, these instructions themselves execute asynchronously. So when I execute a write back or a flush optimal, it's not guaranteed that the execution will stop until that cache line is persisted. But worse than that, these instructions themselves can be reordered. So when I put a cache line write back, it's not guaranteed that it will be executed at exactly the program point I intended. So as a result, it will not have the effect that I want to. And I can't solve this problem. Now, at this point, it might seem that all is lost and we can't solve this problem. But in fact, there is a solution. So what Intel proposes is something called a persist sequence. So if I wanted to stop this behavior, what I can do is I can insert one of these explicit persists, let's say the cache line write back, followed by a fence, specifically a store fence or something stronger, and stop this. And what the sequence does, it does 2 things. First, it says, okay, it achieves this synchronous behavior. It says wait until the cache line that contains X is actually persisted to memory. And second, in this particular example at least, it stops any reordering. So this effect will take place at exactly the program point that you intended. And as a result, you will remove both of these behaviors. Now, I said that there are 3 of these instructions, of these persist instructions: the write back, the flush optimal, and the flush. And I just want to tell you briefly the differences. And in fact, there are differences. They vary both in terms of their strength and in terms of their performance. And by strength, I mean in terms of the ordering constraints that they impose on the execution. In particular, the write back and flush optimal have exactly the same ordering constraints. So from a theoretical specification point of view, there is no difference between them. They have the same guarantees. But the write back performs better. And the reason is that when you execute a write back, when it persists a particular cache line, it doesn't invalidate it. So you won't have cache misses in the future. Whereas flush optimal does invalidate the cache line. And there is also the CL flush, the cache line flush, which is the strongest of all of them in terms of the ordering constraints. But it's also worst in performance because it does invalidate the cache line and it has stronger ordering constraints. Okay, so this was a brief overview of sequential x86. Now let's move on to concurrency. What does it mean to port all of this to the concurrent x86 model? Now, as some of you would know, the x86 architecture follows this model called TSO, Total Store Ordering. So let me very, very quickly tell you what that is, and then we will move on to extending it with persistency. So, in a nutshell, you can think of the concurrent x86 hardware as follows. So, I have my multiple threads of computation. Each one of them has its own local buffer, thread local buffer, that's only visible to the thread. And at the bottom, I have the memory. So, every time a thread issues a write, it will go to this thread local buffer. And at some future point, this write will be propagated to memory. And every time a thread issues a read, it will first check its own buffer. If there is an entry there, it will fetch it from there. If not, it will go to memory. And of course, this is the traditional x86 model, that everything is volatile. So if I have a crash, all of the information will be lost in the buffers and in the memory. Now, I've shown you the sequential but persistent px86 model. I've shown you the existing concurrent and volatile x86 model. And now we want to take these two and combine them to get the concurrent and persistent x86 model. And naturally, what we would do is that we would take the local buffers in the concurrent model, combine them with the persistent buffer and the persistent memory, and obtain a picture like this. So, to zoom in a little bit more, essentially, in this hierarchy, every time a thread issues a write, it will first be added to its local buffer. And now remember, these local buffers are thread local, they're not visible by other threads. So at this point, that write is not visible to other threads. Now, that write will eventually be propagated. It will be unbuffered from the thread local buffer, and it will be added to the persistence buffer. At this point, the write becomes visible to other threads, so you can say that it has reached its coherence point, but it's not yet persistent. It's still volatile because it's in the persistence buffer. Now, eventually, the write will be unbuffered from the persistence buffer, and it will reach the memory, the non-volatile memory, and at that point, it remains visible to other threads, but it's also persistent. So going back to our previous terminology, you can think of the order in which the writes are unbuffered from thread local buffers as your consistency model. Because remember, the consistency model describes the order in which the writes are made visible to other threads. So it is when they leave the thread local buffers that they become visible to other threads. Analogously, you can think of the order in which the writes leave the persistence buffer as your persistency model, because that's the order the writes reach the persistent memory is your persistency model. And together, they give you the MVM semantics of px86. To formalize all of this, we had to pore over the Intel manual, which is 5,000 plus pages. It's better than this, though. It's 5,000 plus pages, and it's all in English, and it contains phrases like, oh, cache time write back cannot be ordered with respect to such and such instructions. And as a result, because of all this English text, it's full of ambiguities and in some cases inaccuracies. And in fact, in collaboration with our wonderful co-author, Gil Niger, a chief architect at Intel, we realized that in some cases, the text of the manual is too weak and it's not correct. It does not reflect the architectural intent. So to fix this, we wanted to be faithful to the manual, but we also wanted to capture the architectural intent. So what we did, we came up with two models. First, we developed a model called px86man, the manual model, which is faithful to the manual text, but it is indeed weaker than the architects had in mind. And we formalized this both operationally and declaratively, and we proved that they are equivalent. And on the other hand, because we wanted to capture what the architects had in mind, we developed a model called px86sim, and at this time, it is stronger than the manual text, but it does capture the architectural intent, as Gil puts it. And I believe that at the time that we published this article, these inaccuracies, these ambiguities were reported back to Intel, and we were told they will revise the manual, so we will see about that. And that brings me to the end of my talk. I've shown you a very, very brief overview of the Intel Persistency Semantics. This was just a nutshell. There are more lovely, wonderful, strange behaviors in the paper, so please have a look. There's also a little bit more in the paper about different libraries that we have implemented on top of x86 persistent libraries, in particular a transactional library and a persistent queue library. And of course, there is a lot more to be done in the future, including program logic, litmus testing, model checking. Some of this work is in progress, so stay tuned, and thank you very much for listening. Ben.
So you say this is an architectural model. Do you have some idea what actual hardware does?
Well, At this point, so it is typical in this line of work to do some hardware validation, right? But hardware validation in the MVM context is very difficult because when you want to check a consistency model, you run a litmus test 1,000 times, 100 times, however you want to, you observe the behavior. But here you want to observe the program behavior after a crash. So what are you going to do? Are you going to sit there and keep restarting your machine? That's very difficult. And as a result, lovely John Wickerson, my co-author, and I are in the process of developing a custom hardware solution where you use FPGAs to monitor the traffic that leaves memory in order to validate these. So at this stage, the only validation that we have is the say-so of the chief architect of Intel. But in the future, we will see. So was the talk so clear that we have?
You speculate on how much you expect this model to change as Intel releases more processors?
So that is a hard question. My gut tells me that it's not going to change much because it's actually a fairly reasonable model. In particular, when you compare it to the ARM persistency semantics, which we have also formalized, this has a range of promises, a range of guarantees from weak to strong. For instance, you can use a much stronger write back like a flush or a much weaker one. Like the write back. So I don't expect it to change much. I do expect maybe when we actually look at the implementation, the way I was talking to Ben, when we actually do some litmus testing, maybe to observe some behaviors that were not expected, but I don't actually think the intent that they had to change much. Ben?
So you said that you have a model that's quite weak, much weaker than TSO itself. Can you give us an idea of how weak the persistency model is compared to maybe TSO or maybe just ARM?
So I didn't say exactly it's weaker than the TSO, but when you think about instruction reordering under TSO, it's very limited. You're only allowed write to write, read, or whatever. Whereas here, more or less everything can be reordered, and you only have this guarantee of these write-backs not being reordered per cache line, and that's it. And with respect to fences. But more or less everything else is fair game. Okay, what's happening?
Okay, so since you mentioned